I was standing outside a luxury VIP fitting room with my black credit card in my hand, ready to pay $18,000 for my daughter's custom wedding dress. That was when I heard her tell her fiance that my life of hard, honest work was an embarrassment, and that she did not want me at her wedding events. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply nodded, canceled every single payment I had made, and ensured her big day became the most humiliating moment of her entire life. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her perfect facade, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that disrespect should never be rewarded. My name is William Gallagher. I am 70 years old. I built a massive commercial plumbing and heating empire in Chicago from absolutely nothing. I was standing in the immaculate white hallway of an elite bridal boutique in the wealthiest part of the city. The air smelled of expensive vanilla and fresh lilies. The floor was covered in plush white carpet that felt far too soft for my old leather work boots. I had stepped away from the velvet seating area for just a moment to take a quick phone call from Derek. Derek is my loyal chief operating officer, and we had to resolve a sudden issue with a commercial supply order. When I finished the call and walked back towards the fitting room, the heavy curtain was pulled slightly open. I was just about to step in and hand over my card to pay for the dress when I heard Preston speaking. Preston Rhodes was 35 years old. He was a smooth-talking man who called himself a tech venture capitalist. He wore imported tailored suits that cost more than my very first service truck. I heard him complaining loudly about the seating chart for the upcoming rehearsal dinner. He sounded incredibly annoyed and disgusted. He said that having me sit at the head table with his elite Silicon Valley investors would completely ruin the aesthetic of the evening. He complained that I did not know how to dress properly, how to speak to people of their caliber, or how to behave in high society. I stood perfectly still and waited for my daughter to defend me. Natalie is 32 years old. I expected her to shut him down to remind him of who I was and what I had done for both of them. Instead, she let out a cold, dismissive laugh that chilled me to the bone. "Do not worry, Preston," she sneered. Her voice was dripping with absolute contempt. "He is just a walking ATM. A guy who spent 40 years fixing toilets and air conditioners is not exactly someone I want to show off to your network. I am going to tell him not to come to the rehearsal dinner at all. He would just embarrass us." I froze right there in the hallway. The heavy black card in my hand suddenly felt like a block of solid lead. I looked down at my hands. They were heavily calloused and permanently scarred from decades of gripping steel wrenches and hauling iron pipes through the freezing Chicago winters. I built my company from a single rusty van. I spent 40 years crawling through dark, damp basements and repairing freezing rooftops in the dead of winter just to make sure Natalie never had to struggle for a single day in her life. When my beautiful wife Carolyn passed away 15 years ago, it shattered my heart into a million pieces. Caroline was the absolute light of my life. After we buried her, I poured all my grief into working even harder. I wanted to make sure our daughter had the best life possible. I paid for Natalie's Ivy League tuition entirely in cash. I bought her first luxury apartment in the city. I funded her entire lifestyle so she could play the role of a high society event planner without ever actually having to earn a real paycheck. I gave her everything she ever pointed at. I sacrificed my own comfort, my own health, and my own free time just to see her smile. And this was my reward. Being called a walking ATM by the daughter I gave everything to. Hearing her say that my life of hard, honest labor was an absolute embarrassment to her and her pretentious friends. I stood there listening to them chuckle together. Preston agreed with her, saying they needed to carefully curate the guest list to exclude anyone who looked too working class. He said my presence would lower the perceived value of his personal brand and make him look bad in front of potential business partners. Natalie hummed in agreement, saying she would figure out a polite lie to keep me away from the important guests. My chest tightened with a heavy, suffocating pain. It was a grief completely different from when I lost Caroline. This was the terrible, sickening grief of realizing that the child you raised had turned into a monster of entitlement and greed. But as I listened to them planning to hide me away like a dirty secret, the pain slowly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I was a man who solved complex engineering problems for a living. I did not operate on emotion alone. I operated on facts and logic. And the undeniable fact was that my daughter did not love me. She only loved my wallet. I took a deep, steadying breath. I pushed the heavy velvet curtain back and stepped fully into the room. Preston jumped in surprise, spilling his expensive champagne onto the plush white carpet. Natalie spun around, her face dropping instantly when she saw me standing there. She was wearing the extravagant $18,000 gown I was about to purchase. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear a pin drop. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger on my face. I looked directly into her eyes and asked, "Is that how you truly feel about me, Natalie?" For a brief second, she looked panicked, but she did not look ashamed. She did not offer a single word of apology or try to pretend I had misunderstood. Instead, she lifted her chin, crossed her arms, and looked at me with pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Dad," she said coldly, "your friends and our friends are very different. Preston's network is vital for our financial future. Bumping shoulders with plumbers and contractors at the rehearsal dinner is going to be terrible for our image. Just stay away from the high-class events and let us handle the guest list. You do not fit in with these people." I stared at her. The sweet little girl I had raised had completely disappeared. She was entirely replaced by this cold, entitled stranger standing in front of me. She truly believed that my money belonged to her, but my presence was a stain on her perfect life. She expected me to nod, apologize for my background, and hand over my credit card anyway. I slowly walked over to the marble counter where the boutique manager was waiting nervously. She had heard everything and looked down at the floor in extreme discomfort. I placed my black card firmly on the glass counter. "Pay for the dress," I told the manager. "Process the transaction right now." The manager quickly swiped the card and handed me the receipt. I signed it with a steady hand. Natalie let out a small, relieved sigh, clearly thinking she had won. She thought I was just going to accept the terrible disrespect and continue funding her lavish lifestyle without consequence. I turned back to my daughter and her arrogant fiance. I looked at the beautiful white dress she was wearing, paid for by the very same hard work she completely despised. I gave her a single calm nod. "I will give you exactly what you asked for, Natalie," I said quietly. "You do not have to worry about me embarrassing you ever again." Then I turned around and walked out of the store, leaving them alone in their perfect little world. I did not look back. I stepped out into the crisp Chicago air and walked toward my truck. I knew right then and there that the wedding preparations were going to continue, but my role as the silent provider was officially over. I was going to teach them exactly what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. The drive back to my house was a cold blur of neon lights and concrete. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind raced relentlessly, yet my chest felt entirely hollow. For 15 years, ever since Caroline passed away, I operated under a single driving purpose: keep Natalie safe, keep her happy. I poured my sweat, my youth, and my entire heart into my commercial plumbing business. I missed holidays and quiet weekends. I worked through severe pneumonia. I ruined my lower back hauling massive industrial boilers up frozen stairwells just so she could walk through elite university campuses without a single financial care in the world. And tonight, standing in a velvet-lined room smelling of pure entitlement, I learned exactly what my lifelong sacrifice meant to her. Nothing. I was a social embarrassment, a walking bank account with a pulse. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the paralyzing shock evaporated. The stinging pain of betrayal hardened into an unbreakable resolve. I did not storm into the house. I did not throw things or scream into the empty rooms. A man who builds massive commercial systems from the ground up learns how to assess a catastrophic failure calmly. You do not panic when a high-pressure boiler bursts. You calmly shut off the main valve, analyze the structural damage, and systematically replace the corrupted parts. My only daughter was the corrupted part. I walked slowly through the quiet halls of my empty home. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Natalie. Natalie in her private school uniform. Natalie holding her diploma. Natalie smiling brightly on the beaches of southern France. Every frame represented a massive check I happily written. I walked straight past them, ignoring the smiling faces, and went directly into my private study. I locked the heavy oak door firmly behind me. I turned on the small brass desk lamp, casting a sharp circle of yellow light across the dark wood of my desk. I booted up my secure corporate laptop and opened the master financial ledger. I needed to see the raw data. I needed to see exactly how blind I had been. For the past year, I gave Natalie and Preston open access to a dedicated wedding account. I trusted them to be reasonable adults. I opened the bank statements, and the staggering numbers staring back at me made my blood run entirely cold. The original budget we agreed upon was a generous $100,000. The current balance drawn from that specific account was $350,000, and the wedding was still several weeks away. I started clicking through the itemized transactions line by line. They systematically funneled my money into their extravagant lifestyle. There were recurring charges for $30,000 at a travel agency for a pre-wedding vacation in the Maldives. There were countless receipts for $10,000 in imported designer luggage. I pulled up my corporate logistics accounts, the ones Natalie technically had emergency access to as a board member. I found a massive lease agreement for a luxury SUV buried under a generic operational expense code. Preston actively authorized it. They were shamelessly siphoning capital directly from the accounts that funded the hard-earned pensions of my loyal plumbers. I sat back heavily in my leather chair. The oppressive silence of the house pressed against my ears. I was not just funding a lavish wedding celebration. I was actively feeding a greedy parasite. I unfortunately created a monster of pure, unfiltered entitlement. Preston, a man who loudly claimed to be a highly successful tech venture capitalist, had contributed absolutely nothing to this event. He was living entirely off the sweat and blood of an old plumber he openly despised. He was a complete financial fraud, and my daughter was a willing, eager accomplice to his theft. I took off my reading glasses and rubbed the aching bridge of my nose. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously calculated, it completely severed the emotional bond I had been foolishly clinging to. The loving father, who would do anything for his little girl, died in that quiet study. He was instantly replaced by the ruthless chief executive officer of my company. And a chief executive officer does not tolerate blatant embezzlement under any circumstances. I slowly formulated my strategic plan. I would not cancel the wedding preparations immediately. Not yet. I would let them have their perfect high-class day. I would sit exactly where they told me to sit, and I would smile exactly when they told me to smile. But the very second that official marriage certificate was signed, the bank vault would slam shut permanently. I would sever her from every corporate account, revoke her emergency access, immediately cancel all the credit cards, and completely remove her from my estate. Let Preston's imaginary venture capital fund support her highly expensive tastes. They wanted me out of their high society life, and I was going to grant them their wish with absolute devastating finality. I printed out the damning financial records, neatly stacked the papers into a thick manila folder, and locked them securely inside my heavy steel floor safe. I spun the cold metallic dial, feeling a profound, heavy sense of closure. The final decision was made. The blinding grief was gone. Only the cold execution of the plan remained. I turned off the brass desk lamp, plunging the study into absolute darkness. I stood silently by the tall window, looking out over the quiet lawns of my wealthy suburban neighborhood, wondering how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Then the heavy silence of the house was violently shattered. The loud brass chime of the front doorbell echoed sharply through the dark hallway. I glanced at the antique clock in the corner of the study. It was exactly midnight. No one comes to your door at midnight to offer polite conversation. My first instinct was to ignore it, to leave whoever it was standing out in the freezing cold. But the doorbell rang a second time, much longer and more insistent than before. I walked slowly out of the study and moved silently down the long, dark hallway toward the main foyer. I did not turn on the interior lights. I cautiously approached the heavy, solid mahogany front door and leaned close to peer quietly through the small, circular glass peephole. Standing alone on my front porch, brightly illuminated by the security light, was Preston. He was still wearing his immaculate suit from the boutique fitting room. He was shifting his weight nervously, looking over his shoulder at the empty street. In his left hand, he was clutching a velvet-lined box holding a $500 bottle of aged scotch. In his right hand, he held a bulging leather briefcase. The man who had just called me a walking ATM, the man who had demanded I be hidden away from his guests, was now standing on my porch in the dead of night, offering a fake olive branch. I unlocked the heavy mahogany door and pulled it open just enough to frame his silhouette against the freezing night. Preston offered a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He held up the velvet box like a shield. He told me he knew it was incredibly late, but he simply could not sleep, knowing there was a terrible tension between us. He said he brought my favorite single malt scotch to smooth things over. I looked quietly at the bottle. It was indeed a rare vintage, the kind of luxury item he could only afford by using the supplementary credit cards I had foolishly provided for the wedding catering expenses. I did not say a single word about the bitter irony of the situation. I simply swung the door open and allowed him to step into the warm foyer. He brushed a few flakes of snow off his expensive cashmere overcoat and followed me silently into the dimly lit study. He acted as though the humiliating scene at the bridal boutique had just been a minor misunderstanding between old friends. He walked with a confident swagger that deeply irritated me, but I kept my facial features perfectly blank. I needed to see exactly what kind of game he was attempting to play tonight. I took my seat behind the massive oak desk while Preston made himself comfortable in one of the plush leather guest chairs. He opened the velvet box and poured 2 generous glasses of the amber liquid. He slid one across the polished wood toward me. He leaned back in the chair and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "William," he said, his voice dripping with practiced empathy, "you have to forgive Natalie. She is under an enormous amount of pressure right now. You know how these high society weddings are. The expectations from my investors are just astronomical, and she wants everything to be flawless." He took a sip of his drink and smiled warmly. He called it classic bridezilla syndrome. He insisted that she did not mean a single word she said in that fitting room earlier today. He told me that Natalie loves me more than anyone in the world, and that she was just acting out of sheer anxiety because she wants everything to be absolutely perfect for both of our families. I sat there in total silence. I listened to his smooth, rehearsed cadence. I knew for an absolute fact that my daughter had not shed a single tear of remorse. I knew she had sent him here to do immediate damage control because she was absolutely terrified I would cut off the wedding funding. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression completely neutral. I told him I understood exactly how stressful modern wedding planning could be. I watched his shoulders visibly relax. He clearly thought he had successfully pacified the foolish old plumber. He thought a glass of expensive liquor and a few hollow apologies were enough to erase the profound disrespect I had endured. He took another sip of his scotch and then casually reached down to open his bulging leather briefcase. He acted as though it was just an afterthought, a minor administrative detail that he suddenly remembered in the middle of our friendly conversation. "By the way, William," he said, pulling out a remarkably thick stack of legal documents, "we have a tiny logistical hurdle to clear before tomorrow morning." He placed the heavy stack of papers squarely on my desk. He explained that the Ritz-Carlton management needed my physical signature to officially finalize the $150,000 ballroom deposit. I looked down at the documents resting on the dark wood. The stack was easily 40 pages thick. That seemed highly excessive for a simple venue deposit. I stared at the pristine white pages. I asked him why a hotel required such an extensive volume of paperwork just to secure a dining room for a single evening. Preston waved his hand dismissively. He chuckled a low, comforting sound designed to disarm any lingering suspicion. He said the hotel corporate lawyers were just being incredibly paranoid lately due to some recent property damage incidents. He claimed it was standard insurance liability stuff for a venue of that magnitude. He said they just needed the primary financial sponsor to sign off on the basic property damage waivers before they could begin constructing the elaborate floral installations we had ordered. He spoke quickly, but smoothly, deliberately, trying to make the massive stack of legal documents seem like a tedious, boring formality that I should simply sign without reading. He wanted me to wave it through to trust his expertise and to go back to being the silent, generous benefactor I had always been. My eyes scanned the top page. It bore the crest of the hotel, but the sheer volume of text beneath it felt entirely wrong. He leaned across the wide expanse of the oak desk and handed me a sleek silver pen. The ambient light from the hallway caught the edge of his eyes. He was smiling, but it was an overly eager, completely unblinking smile. The charm he was projecting suddenly felt intensely aggressive. It was the exact same predatory look I had seen on the faces of corrupt commercial contractors right before they tried to scam me on a massive downtown construction project. My internal alarms began to ring with a deafening volume. 40 years in the harsh, brutal business world of commercial heating and plumbing had honed my survival instincts to an absolute razor edge. I had negotiated multi-million-dollar union contracts. I had survived vicious corporate audits. You do not survive in the Chicago commercial construction industry by signing thick stacks of legal documents at midnight without reading every single clause. You do not build an empire from a single rusty van by blindly trusting a man who smiles too widely while asking for your signature. I looked at the silver pen in his outstretched hand. I looked at his perfectly manicured fingers holding it. I looked at the perfectly aligned stack of papers sitting on my desk, waiting to seal my fate. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that whatever was buried deep inside those pages had absolutely nothing to do with wedding flowers or hotel liability waivers. He was not asking me to secure a ballroom for a party. He was handing me a loaded weapon and eagerly waiting for me to pull the trigger on myself. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could hear the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner, marking the precise seconds of this dangerous game. Preston continued to hold the pen toward me, his unblinking eyes watching my every move with predatory anticipation. He truly believed he had me completely cornered. He believed my love for my daughter would override my basic common sense. I took a slow, deep breath, keeping my face as calm and stoic as stone. I reached out across the polished wood and slowly took the silver pen from his hand, preparing to systematically call his very desperate and foolish bluff. I pulled the heavy document stack toward me across the dark, polished mahogany wood, deliberately leaving the silver pen resting on the green leather desk pad for a long moment. Preston watched me with that same synthetic, unblinking smile, his entire body remaining completely rigid with an unnatural level of nervous anticipation. I could practically hear the rapid, anxious beating of his heart echoing over the steady, rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner of the room. He clearly thought he was playing a masterclass game of psychological manipulation tonight, but he had entirely forgotten who he was dealing with under this roof. To him, I was just an aging, uneducated blue-collar worker whose mind was slowly softening with retirement and grief. He thought my 40 years of manual labor and fixing heating systems meant I lacked the intellectual capacity to decipher complicated corporate paperwork. He was dead wrong. I flipped open the very first page of the contract with a slow, deliberate motion, letting the crisp white paper rustle loudly in the quiet room. The pristine letterhead was beautifully embossed, displaying the official gold crest of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel downtown. The initial clauses looked standard enough to the untrained eye, detailing the formal reservation of the grand ballroom, the scheduling of the gourmet catering services, and the exact logistical arrangements for the ice sculptures. Preston leaned forward slightly in his chair, his gray eyes tracking the slight movement of my calloused fingers as I turned the pages. He told me smoothly that everything was perfectly straightforward, and that I only needed to sign the designated lines at the bottom of pages 4, 12, and 30. I did not give him a direct answer. I simply let out a slow, tired nod, letting my shoulders slump heavily to perfectly mimic the posture of a completely exhausted old man who was ready for bed. When I turned to page 4, my eyes immediately locked onto a long, dense paragraph hidden beneath a massive block of small font legalese. The title of the specific section read, Commercial Venue Liability, which perfectly matched the innocent story Preston had spun. But as a man who had spent 40 hard years thoroughly reviewing major municipal supply contracts, insurance policies, and commercial property leases, I knew exactly how predatory developers hid their legal traps. I never just look at the bold titles. I always systematically read the finest print. My eyes ran over a string of small, tightly packed sentences embedded directly in the middle of the third paragraph. The text completely shifted away from hotel liability or event security. It contained standard aggressive boilerplate language explicitly detailing the legal terms for corporate asset collateralization. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second, but I kept my facial features entirely calm, a perfect mask of pure, unbothered confusion. This was not an event agreement for a wedding reception. Deep inside page 4, the hidden text explicitly stated that the signee was fully authorizing the unconditional use of Gallagher Mechanical and Logistics Group as a primary corporate guarantor for a separate commercial line of credit. It meant that by signing these pages, I was not just paying a $150,000 ballroom deposit for my daughter. I was legally pledging my entire life's work, my fleet of 50 commercial vehicles, and my valuable warehouse properties as direct collateral for a massive $3 million banking loan. Preston was using my company as a financial shield to pull a massive amount of cash out of a commercial bank, and if he defaulted, the bank would legally liquidate everything I owned. I let out a soft, dry cough and adjusted my reading glasses, pretending to struggle with the faint light cast by the brass desk lamp. I looked up at Preston and asked him calmly if the hotel always required this much fine print for a simple dinner party. Preston let out a quick, breezy laugh, waving his hand in the air to dismiss my question as nothing more than automated corporate standard. He told me the hospitality industry had become entirely flooded with absurd regulations after the pandemic, and that the corporate lawyers just wanted to make sure they were fully covered against any potential property damages caused by the wedding guests. He urged me to just flip to the final signature page so we could celebrate the contract with the expensive scotch he had poured. I gave him a slow, compliant smile, acting like a clueless old man who was too tired to care about the details. I reached into my plaid shirt pocket and pulled out my own pen instead of using his silver one. It looked like a standard cheap plastic ballpoint pen, but it was actually a specialized friction ink pen that Derek had given me from our logistics office. The unique polymer ink looks completely permanent to the naked eye, but it entirely evaporates when exposed to mild heat, leaving the white paper absolutely pristine. I placed the tip of the pen on the crisp paper and slowly signed my name on the signature lines of page 4 and page 12. I made sure to alter the slant of my handwriting, slightly just enough to add another layer of legal deniability, if I ever needed to challenge the document in a court of law. Just as I was about to turn to the final page, Preston's smartphone buzzed violently on the leather armrest of his chair. He glanced down at the screen, and his face instantly transformed into a mask of intense urgency. He looked up at me nervously, clearing his throat. He apologized quickly, stating that it was a highly critical investor call from the West Coast that he absolutely had to take immediately. He rose from his chair and walked quickly toward the far corner of the dark study, turning his back to me as he whispered frantically into his phone. This was the exact opening I needed to execute my secret move. The very second his back was turned, I quietly slid my smartphone out of my lap. I flipped the contract back to page 4. My hands were perfectly steady as I held the phone directly above the document, ensuring the yellow light of the lamp illuminated every single line of the fraudulent collateral text. I snapped a crystal-clear photograph of the hidden terms. I quickly turned to the appendix pages at the back, capturing the bank routing numbers and specific corporate entity names Preston had illegally tied to my business. I immediately uploaded the images to a secure cloud server. By the time Preston finished his call, my smartphone was safely hidden back inside my pocket. I sat there calmly looking like an oblivious old man lost in his own thoughts. Preston walked back with a triumphant smirk. He reached out to grab the documents. As his arm extended, his shirt cuff pulled back slightly. The light glinted off a polished metallic surface on his wrist. Resting against his skin was a limited edition Patek Philippe timepiece. How does a broke startup guy afford this absolute luxury? I did not ask him about the extremely expensive watch. I simply smiled, nodded, and wished him a good night. I stood in the dark hallway, listening to his heavy footsteps retreat down the porch steps, and watched his taillights fade into the freezing Chicago night. The image of that silver Patek Philippe burned into my mind. A man who desperately needed $150,000 for a wedding reception did not casually wear a watch worth an entire year's salary. It was the final undeniable proof that my daughter was marrying a dangerous financial predator. The next morning, I arrived at the headquarters of Gallagher Mechanical and Logistics Group exactly at 6. The building was already humming with intense activity. The familiar comforting smells of motor oil, freshly cut steel, and dark roasted coffee filled the air. This was my true home. This was the empire I had painstakingly built from absolutely nothing. I walked through the main garage bay, nodding to my senior technicians and dispatchers. These were honest, hardworking people who relied on me to feed their families. I climbed the metal stairs to my second-floor executive office and looked out the wide glass window. Below me sat my pristine fleet of 50 heavy-duty commercial service trucks. They were lined up in perfect rows, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent garage lights. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat behind my desk, preparing to review the photographs I had taken the night before. But before I could even open my secure cloud server, there was a sharp, urgent knock on my door. Derek pushed the door open and stepped inside. Derek had been my chief operating officer for over a decade. He started out as a junior pipe fitter and worked his way up through sheer grit and undeniable loyalty. He was a straightforward, serious man who never panicked over minor issues. But this morning, his thick brow was furrowed in deep confusion. He held a yellow legal pad in his hand and looked entirely unsettled. He closed the door firmly behind him and asked me if we were planning a massive corporate liquidation or a sudden fleet upgrade that he did not know about. I put my coffee cup down and kept my voice perfectly level. I asked him exactly what he meant by that question. Derek consulted his notes and explained that he had just received a very strange phone call from a senior commercial appraiser at First Chicago National Bank. The appraiser was aggressively trying to schedule a full on-site inventory of our entire vehicle fleet. They specifically requested to inspect the titles, the mileage records, and the maintenance logs for all 50 of our commercial trucks. They claimed it was a high-priority corporate directive. I felt a cold, heavy stone drop directly into the bottom of my stomach. I had never done business with First Chicago National Bank. I paid for my fleet entirely in cash years ago. My company carried absolutely zero commercial debt. I forced a calm, dismissive smile for Derek's benefit. I told him it was likely just a massive clerical error or an aggressive banking solicitor trying to drum up new business by updating our corporate valuation. I instructed him to ignore the request for now and promised him I would handle the annoying bank representatives personally. Derek nodded slowly, visibly relieved by my calm demeanor, and stepped out of the office to return to the morning dispatch. The very second the heavy wooden door clicked shut, the facade of the calm chief executive completely vanished. I was entirely alone in my office, but the silence felt suffocating. I turned back to the window and stared down at the rows of white service trucks bearing my family name. My mind flashed back 40 years to the very first vehicle I ever owned. It was a rusted, beaten-down panel van with a failing transmission and no working heat. Caroline and I had scraped together every single penny of our meager savings just to buy it. I remembered the brutally cold January nights, driving that unreliable van across the icy city bridges, praying the engine would hold out long enough for me to finish a late-night emergency repair job. I remembered the intense pride I felt when I was finally able to afford a second truck and then a third. Every single vehicle in that fleet down there represented decades of extreme personal sacrifice, missed family dinners, and completely broken physical health. They were the literal engine of my life's work. And now some arrogant, completely useless fraud was casually offering up my entire life's work to a bank as collateral for his own greedy ambitions. The hidden text I had photographed the night before suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The $150,000 hotel deposit was just a small administrative fee required to process a massive corporate lien. Preston had structured the paperwork to make it look like Gallagher Mechanical and Logistics Group was backing his imaginary tech venture. I walked over to my desk and picked up the phone. My hands were perfectly steady, but my pulse was hammering fiercely in my throat. I dialed the direct extension Derek had written down on the yellow legal pad. A cheerful professional voice answered, identifying himself as a senior commercial loan officer at First Chicago National Bank. I introduced myself smoothly as William Gallagher. I kept my tone entirely professional, projecting the relaxed, confident aura of a wealthy business owner following up on routine paperwork. I apologized for any confusion with my dispatch office earlier and told the loan officer I was simply calling to verify the upcoming appraisal schedule for our corporate files. The loan officer was immediately deferential. He practically tripped over his own words, trying to assure me that everything was moving forward perfectly. He laughed politely and said they were just doing their standard due diligence on the physical assets before finalizing the major capital release. He praised my company's immaculate financial history and said they were absolutely thrilled to be doing business with such a prestigious local enterprise. I smiled a cold, grim smile at the empty room. I asked him completely casually if all the final signatures from last night were satisfactory to proceed with the capital release. The loan officer did not hesitate for a single second. He enthusiastically confirmed that they had received the digitally scanned documents early this morning directly from my son-in-law. He told me the legal department was extremely satisfied with the corporate venue liability waivers acting as the primary guarantor framework. He then cheerfully delivered the final devastating blow. He told me that thanks to my generous corporate backing, Preston Rhodes's $3 million commercial lien was processing perfectly. He casually mentioned that the full $3 million would be completely cleared and successfully wired into Preston's designated external holding account by next Friday afternoon. Next Friday afternoon. Exactly 24 hours before my daughter was scheduled to walk down the aisle, I did not gasp. I did not betray a single ounce of the absolute rage boiling inside my chest. I simply thanked the loan officer for his diligent work, wished him a wonderful day, and quietly hung up the phone. I sat in the profound silence of my office staring at the blinking red light on my desk phone. A massive $3 million loan secured entirely by the blood and sweat of my past 40 years. Preston was planning to extract an absolute fortune from the bank, using my clean corporate reputation as his personal shield. He had orchestrated this entire wedding to keep me distracted and financially bleeding, while he quietly positioned a massive guillotine directly over my neck. He needed me entirely focused on floral arrangements, catering menus, and high society seating charts, so I would never bother to check the fine print of the legal documents he slid across my desk at midnight. And Natalie was right there beside him, eagerly guarding the door to the slaughterhouse. She had actively helped him set the trap for her own father. I stood up from my desk and walked back to the large glass window. I looked at the 50 service trucks, the bustling warehouse, the empire I built to protect my family. They thought they had successfully outsmarted an uneducated blue-collar worker. They thought they were going to walk away with $3 million and leave me to face absolute financial ruin and federal banking investigations. I placed both of my hands flat against the cold glass. The profound heartbreak of losing my daughter was entirely gone. It was completely incinerated by the absolute necessity to survive. I was no longer a grieving father trying to save a broken relationship. I was a veteran executive facing a hostile corporate takeover from a vicious parasite. I picked up my phone and dialed the private number for my forensic attorney. It was time to initiate a complete and total destruction of their perfect little world. I pulled the heavy document stack toward me across the dark wood, deliberately leaving the silver pen resting on the leather desk pad for a long moment. Preston watched me with that same synthetic, unblinking smile, his entire body remaining rigid with nervous anticipation. I could practically hear the rapid, anxious beating of his heart, echoing over the steady ticking of the clock in the corner. He clearly thought he was playing a game of psychological manipulation, but he had forgotten who he was dealing with. To him, I was just an aging blue-collar worker whose mind was softening with retirement and grief. He thought my 40 years of manual labor and fixing systems meant I lacked the capacity to decipher corporate paperwork. He was absolutely dead wrong. I flipped open the first page of the contract, slowly letting the white paper rustle loudly. The pristine letterhead was embossed, displaying the gold crest of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. The initial clauses looked standard enough to the untrained eye, detailing the reservation of the grand ballroom, the scheduling of the catering services, and the arrangements for the ice sculptures. Preston leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracking the movement of my fingers as I turned the pages. He told me smoothly that everything was straightforward and that I only needed to sign the lines on pages 4, 12, and 30. I did not give him an answer. I simply let out a tired nod, letting my shoulders slump to mimic an exhausted old man. When I turned to page 4, my eyes immediately locked onto a long, dense paragraph hidden beneath a massive block of small font legalese. The bold title of the specific section read, "Commercial Venue Liability," which perfectly matched the innocent story Preston had spun. But as a man who had spent 40 hard years thoroughly reviewing major municipal supply contracts, insurance policies, and commercial property leases, I knew exactly how predatory developers hid their legal traps. I never just look at the bold titles. I always systematically read the finest print. My eyes ran over a string of small, tightly packed sentences embedded directly in the middle of the third paragraph. The text completely shifted away from hotel liability or event security. It contained standard, highly aggressive boilerplate language explicitly detailing the exact legal terms for corporate asset collateralization. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second, but I kept my facial features entirely calm, projecting a perfect mask of pure, unbothered confusion. This was not an event agreement for a wedding reception. Deep inside page 4, the hidden text explicitly stated that the signee was fully authorizing the unconditional use of Gallagher Mechanical and Logistics Group as a primary corporate guarantor for a completely separate commercial line of credit. It meant that by signing these pages, I was not just paying a $150,000 ballroom deposit for my daughter. I was legally pledging my entire life's work, my fleet of 50 commercial vehicles, and my valuable warehouse properties as direct collateral for a massive $3 million banking loan. Preston was using my company as a financial shield to pull a massive amount of cash out of a commercial bank, and if he defaulted, the bank would legally liquidate everything I proudly owned. I let out a soft, dry cough and adjusted my reading glasses, pretending to struggle with the faint light cast by the brass desk lamp. I looked up at Preston and asked him calmly if the hotel always required this much fine print for a simple dinner party. Preston let out a quick, breezy laugh, waving his hand in the air to dismiss my question as nothing more than automated corporate standard. He told me the hospitality industry had become entirely flooded with absurd regulations after the pandemic, and that the corporate lawyers just wanted to make sure they were fully covered against any potential property damages caused by the wedding guests. He urged me to just flip to the final signature page so we could celebrate the contract with the expensive scotch he had thoughtfully poured. I gave him a slow, compliant smile, acting like a clueless old man who was too tired to care about the complex details. I reached into my plaid shirt pocket and pulled out my own pen instead of using his silver one. It looked like a standard cheap plastic ballpoint pen, but it was actually a highly specialized friction ink pen that Derek had given me from our logistics office. The unique polymer ink looks completely permanent to the naked eye, but it entirely evaporates when exposed to mild heat, leaving the white paper absolutely pristine. I placed the tip of the pen on the crisp paper and slowly signed my name on the signature lines of page 4 and page 12. I made sure to alter the slant of my handwriting slightly, just enough to add another layer of legal deniability if I ever needed to actively challenge the document in a court of law. Just as I was about to carefully turn to the final page, Preston's smartphone buzzed violently on the leather armrest of his chair. He glanced down at the glowing screen, and his face instantly transformed into a mask of intense, genuine urgency. He looked up at me nervously, clearing his throat loudly. He apologized quickly, stating that it was a highly critical investor call from the West Coast that he absolutely had to take immediately. He rose from his chair and walked quickly toward the far corner of the dark study, turning his back to me as he whispered frantically into his phone. This was the exact opening I desperately needed to execute my secret defensive move. The very second his back was completely turned, I quietly slid my smartphone out of my lap. I flipped the heavy contract back to page 4. My hands were perfectly steady as I held the phone directly above the document, ensuring the yellow light of the brass lamp illuminated every single line of the fraudulent collateral text. I snapped a crystal-clear photograph of the hidden terms. I quickly turned to the dense appendix pages at the back, capturing the bank routing numbers and specific corporate entity names Preston had illegally tied to my business. I immediately uploaded the high-resolution images to a highly secure cloud server. By the time Preston finally finished his hushed call, my smartphone was safely hidden back inside my pocket. I sat there calmly, looking exactly like an oblivious old man lost in his own tired thoughts. Preston walked back to the desk with a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He reached out eagerly to grab the finalized documents. As his arm extended across the polished wood, his tailored shirt cuff pulled back slightly. The ambient light glinted brightly off a polished metallic surface resting against his wrist. It was a limited edition Patek Philippe timepiece. My heart pounded furiously as I stared silently at the flawless, incredibly expensive watch. How does a broke startup guy begging for wedding money afford a luxury item worth $90,000? I ignored the glare of the $90,000 timepiece. I offered a polite nod and wished him a successful final day of wedding preparations. Preston eagerly snatched the documents from the desk, puffing his chest out with victorious pride as he placed the fraudulent paperwork into his briefcase. He thanked me profusely, convinced he had just outsmarted a tired tradesman. I walked him to the door and watched him stride down the driveway, his overcoat flapping in the bitter wind. The moment his taillights disappeared down the street, the facade of the compliant father completely vanished. I did not sleep. Instead, I packed an overnight bag, grabbed my corporate laptop, and drove to an unlisted suite at a downtown hotel. This was a secure location I maintained for sensitive corporate negotiations, a place where no one could track my movements. As soon as I locked the heavy door, I initiated a secure, encrypted conference call. Within 40 minutes, 2 of the most dangerous people in the Chicago corporate world walked in. Benjamin arrived first, carrying a battered satchel. He was my external forensic attorney, a ruthless legal predator who specialized in tearing apart hostile corporate takeovers. Evelyn followed holding a thermos of black coffee. She was my lead fraud accountant, a woman whose mind operated in complex algorithms and hidden offshore routing numbers. They were the ultimate war council summoned when my company was facing an existential threat. I did not waste a single second with pleasantries. I booted up my laptop, connected it to the wireless printer, and produced physical copies of the photographs I secretly took. I laid the pages across the glass dining table and told them exactly what happened. I explained the wedding drama, the midnight visit, the friction ink pen I had used to sign the documents, and the $90,000 watch Preston was casually wearing. Evelyn dropped her coat and leaned over the glass table, her eyes scanning the hidden paragraphs of page 4 with robotic intensity. Benjamin stood silently beside her, crossing his arms as he read the specific legal terminology regarding the corporate asset collateralization. For a tense moment, the only sound in the suite was the rustling of printed pages and the hum of city traffic below. Evelyn suddenly looked up, her expression turning incredibly grim. She pushed her glasses up her nose and tapped her fingernail against the routing numbers listed in the appendix. She told me in a deadpan voice that this was not a standard commercial bank loan. She said the corporate entities listed here did not belong to any legitimate financial institution. She recognized the specific routing structures. She dropped a bombshell that made my blood run entirely cold. She identified the document as a highly sophisticated shadow syndicate loan agreement. Benjamin cursed softly under his breath, confirming her terrifying analysis. He explained that Preston was not just trying to steal $3 million from a regular bank. He was actively borrowing a massive sum of illicit money from a dangerous shadow lending network. These were ruthless criminals who operated completely outside the bounds of traditional law, using complex offshore shell companies to hide their massive financial movements. Preston was legally pledging my pristine, debt-free commercial plumbing business as the primary collateral for this illegal loan. He was using the legitimate reputation of my life's work to secure millions for his own selfish ambitions. Evelyn pointed to the signature lines, her voice shaking slightly with righteous anger. She told me that if Preston defaulted on this illicit loan, or if federal authorities audited the shadow syndicate, the criminals would simply execute the collateral clause. They would legally seize my 50 commercial vehicles, empty my corporate accounts, and completely liquidate my warehouses to recover their dirty money. Because my signature was on the documents, federal investigators would assume I was an active participant in a massive money laundering operation. Preston had engineered the perfect trap. He was going to walk away with millions in untraceable cash, leaving me exposed to face both the violent criminal syndicate and the federal government. I stood by the window looking out over the glowing city skyline, feeling a profound, dangerous rage settling deep into my bones. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously calculated, it completely severed the last remaining emotional bonds I held for my daughter. Natalie had actively helped him set this trap. She had distracted me with wedding drama while he handed me the loaded weapon. Benjamin stated firmly that using the friction ink was a brilliant tactical delay, but it was not enough to protect the company permanently. He said that once Preston submitted the blank documents, the syndicate would immediately realize they had been played. They would aggressively come after Preston, and Preston would inevitably direct their violent anger straight toward me. Benjamin insisted that we needed to strike first. We needed to launch a preemptive legal and financial strike to completely sever my company from his name and actively expose his fraudulent operation to the proper federal authorities before the syndicate could act. Evelyn agreed, but she noted a massive logistical hurdle. She said that in order to build an airtight federal case against him, we needed direct access to his personal communications. We needed his encrypted emails, his offshore banking passwords, and the direct contact information for his syndicate handlers. We needed his personal devices. I shook my head, feeling a deep sense of frustration. I told them that Preston was incredibly paranoid and technically sophisticated. He never left his primary smartphone unattended, and he kept his venture capital laptop locked inside a biometric safe in his upscale apartment. Stealing his devices directly was physically impossible without tipping him off. But then a sudden brilliant realization struck me. Preston was paranoid and incredibly careful with his own digital security, but Natalie was not. My daughter was lazy, entitled, and entirely accustomed to having everything managed for her. For the past 6 years, ever since she entered college, Natalie had routed all of her personal digital devices, her smartphones, her tablets, and her laptops. directly through my secure corporate cloud server for automatic daily backups. She never bothered to change the default administrative settings because I was always the one paying the massive data storage bills. I turned back to Evelyn and smiled a cold, ruthless smile. I told her we did not need to hack Preston's fortified devices. We just needed to access my daughter's backups. Evelyn's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. She pulled her heavy laptop out and connected it to my master terminal. She asked for my primary corporate access codes. I recited them without a single moment of hesitation. I watched as her fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard firewalls and diving deep into the massive archives of the company cloud server. She was systematically pulling up every single text message, every cached password, and every deleted email that had passed through Natalie's personal devices over the last 12 months. The War Council was officially in session, and we were now about to completely dismantle the man who wrongly thought he could easily steal my empire. Evelyn's fingers danced across the illuminated keyboard with mechanical precision. The suite was completely silent, except for the rapid clicking of keys and the low hum of city traffic drifting through the windows. I stood behind her chair, arms crossed over my chest, watching the glowing screen. Benjamin paced slowly near the minibar, sipping his black coffee, his eyes fixed on the unfolding digital excavation. Natalie had always been careless with her digital footprint. She used the same basic passwords for everything since she was a teenager, mostly variations of her childhood pets. It took Evelyn less than 14 minutes to completely bypass the standard security protocols and access the heavily archived folders on my corporate server. The screen suddenly populated with thousands of files ranging from hundreds of wedding reference photos to endless strings of text message backups. Evelyn did not waste time looking at the superficial data. She immediately ran a specialized search algorithm designed to isolate financial spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and encrypted communication applications. Within moments, the algorithm hit a massive cluster of hidden folders. Evelyn opened the first primary directory, which was labeled with the name of Preston's supposed venture capital firm. We had been led to believe he was managing a highly successful portfolio of emerging technology companies. I leaned in closer to the screen as Evelyn began opening the corporate tax filings and the official state registration documents. What we found was a complete financial void. There were zero active investments. There were absolutely no technological startups, software engineers, or corporate acquisitions. The official documentation clearly showed that Preston's highly touted venture capital firm had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 3 years ago. The entire corporate entity had been formally dissolved by a federal judge due to gross financial mismanagement. For the past 3 years, Preston had been aggressively peddling a completely dead company. He had been walking into elite country clubs, high society dinners, and my own home, projecting the perfect image of a wealthy tech genius, while in absolute reality, he did not possess a single legitimate source of income. He was a ghost living entirely on a meticulously constructed foundation of lies. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. If he had absolutely zero income for 3 years, how was he affording the designer suits, the lavish pre-wedding vacations, and the luxury timepiece sitting on his wrist? Evelyn anticipated my exact question. Her eyes narrowed as she launched a secondary search protocol, diving into a heavily encrypted messaging application she had isolated from Natalie's old smartphone backup. She explained that while the application itself was designed to delete messages immediately after they were read, Natalie's sloppy habit of taking screenshots to save specific account numbers had left a permanent trail of digital breadcrumbs. Evelyn systematically pieced the fragmented screenshots together like a complex mosaic across her monitor. The dark, terrifying reality of Preston's actual profession began to materialize before our eyes. He was not a venture capitalist. He was a degenerate gambler who had somehow drowned himself in an ocean of illicit debt. The screenshots revealed a desperate series of communications between Preston and an organized underground sports betting syndicate operating deep within the city. The messages were brutal and incredibly clear. Preston had spent the last 2 years desperately chasing massive losses on illegal offshore gambling platforms, borrowing heavily from violent, unregulated shadow lenders to cover his tracks. Evelyn highlighted a specific digital ledger that had been transmitted 3 weeks ago. The numbers displayed on the screen made my breathing temporarily stop. Preston was currently $2.5 million in the hole. The shadow syndicate was aggressively demanding immediate repayment plus an exorbitant amount of predatory interest. The messages from the syndicate handlers were no longer polite requests for capital. They were explicit threats involving severe physical violence and public humiliation. They knew exactly who he was marrying, and they knew exactly who I was. Preston had clearly leveraged my corporate reputation to secure the initial lines of illegal credit, promising the syndicate that he had unrestricted access to my massive commercial plumbing empire. When his gambling losses became entirely unmanageable, the syndicate had forced his hand, demanding he formalize the debt by legally collateralizing my commercial fleet. That was the reason for the $3 million shadow loan agreement, disguised as a hotel liability waiver. He was using my life's work to pay off his gambling debts before the violent debt collectors could show up at the wedding reception. Benjamin cursed loudly, slamming his hand down on the glass table. He pointed out the terrifying reality that if I had blindly signed that document and walked away, the syndicate would have possessed complete unassailable legal authority to seize my business the very second Preston inevitably defaulted on the payments. The sheer scale of the financial deception was breathtaking. But it was not the most devastating discovery of the night. Evelyn remained completely silent, her face glowing pale in the harsh monitor light. She had opened a final folder containing the direct, unencrypted text message history between Preston and Natalie. She slowly turned the laptop toward me, her eyes filled with a deep, reluctant sympathy. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had desperately wanted to believe that my daughter was just a foolish, naive victim in this entire scenario. I wanted to believe that she had been completely blinded by love, entirely manipulated by a charismatic sociopath who hid his dark gambling addiction behind a charming smile. The text messages instantly shattered that comforting illusion into a million jagged pieces. I read through the chronological exchange, the words burning themselves permanently into my memory. Natalie knew everything. She knew about the absolute bankruptcy. She knew about the crippling gambling debts. She knew about the violent threats from the shadow syndicate. Instead of coming to me for help, instead of canceling the wedding and running away from a dangerous predator, she had actively conspired to feed me to the wolves. I read a specific exchange dated 4 months ago, right around the time I first agreed to fund the wedding. Preston had texted her expressing deep panic about a preliminary credit verification document the syndicate was demanding. Natalie's response was incredibly calm, meticulously calculating, and utterly devoid of any moral hesitation. She typed out a detailed set of instructions, actively coaching Preston on exactly how to access my private home office while I was away at a commercial job site. She told him exactly where I kept my old tax returns and my physical banking ledgers. She even provided him with clear photographs of my signature from old birthday cards, explicitly telling him to practice the loops and angles until he could perfectly forge it on the preliminary banking documents. She had actively, willingly facilitated the initial forgery that allowed Preston to set the entire trap in motion. I stood absolutely frozen in the center of the suite. The deep, unconditional love of a protective father completely evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a chief executive officer preparing for absolute war. The silence in the dimly lit hotel suite was absolute heavy with the suffocating weight of the digital evidence glowing brightly on Evelyn's monitor. Benjamin and Evelyn watched my face intently, giving me the quiet space necessary to process the ultimate betrayal. A father's heart is a remarkably stubborn thing, often clinging to the absolute last shred of lingering hope, even when presented with undeniable facts. Despite reading the damning text messages, a tiny irrational part of my brain whispered that perhaps Natalie had been coerced, that perhaps she was terrified of Preston and simply playing along out of sheer desperation. I needed to know exactly how far she was truly willing to go of her own free will. I needed to witness her active participation in this massive fraud with my own eyes before I pulled the trigger on a legal strike that would inevitably send her to a federal penitentiary. I turned away from Evelyn's monitor and walked slowly back to my own corporate laptop resting on the glass dining table. I opened a secure, encrypted application and logged directly into my home security network. When Caroline passed away 15 years ago, I had upgraded the entire property with discrete, high-definition cameras, primarily to ensure Natalie was always perfectly safe when I was working late at the corporate headquarters. I never imagined I would eventually use the advanced system to actively monitor her committing a severe felony against me. The live video feeds populated across my screen, displaying the quiet, dark rooms of my suburban house in crisp detail. I checked the digital timestamp glowing in the corner of the monitor. It was currently 2 a.m. Preston had left my study a few hours ago, deeply convinced he possessed the finalized collateral signatures. But a shadow syndicate loan of that massive magnitude requires far more than just a forged signature on a fake hotel liability waiver. They demand absolute physical proof of identity to legally finalize the corporate lien and secure the dirty money. They would definitively need my original certified birth certificate and my physical notarized corporate tax returns from the previous 3 years. I kept those highly sensitive documents locked inside a heavy steel floor safe, hidden completely out of sight, beneath a woven Persian rug in my private study. I clicked on the specific camera feed positioned directly above the study door and expanded the high-resolution video to fill the entire laptop screen. Benjamin and Evelyn stepped up quietly behind me, their eyes fixed intently on the glowing monitor. For a long, agonizing 10 minutes, the room remained completely dark and perfectly still. The only movement was the slow, sweeping shadows cast by the streetlights outside the tall windows. Then the heavy, solid oak door slowly creaked open. A slender figure slipped into the room holding a small, specialized tactical flashlight. It was Natalie. She was still wearing the expensive silk pajamas I had proudly purchased for her bridal shower just 2 weeks ago. She did not hesitate for a single second. She did not look around the room with any sense of guilt, fear, or apprehension. She moved with the cold, practiced efficiency of a professional corporate thief. She walked directly past the framed photographs of our family, resting on the mahogany desk, completely ignoring the smiling faces of her childhood. She stepped deliberately onto the center of the Persian rug, grabbed the thick woven edge and rolled it back to expose the metallic dial of the floor safe. She dropped smoothly to her knees and held the small flashlight between her teeth, illuminating the dark steel combination lock. I watched in absolute horrified fascination as my only daughter began to expertly spin the cold steel dial. She did not even need to guess the numbers. She knew the precise combination perfectly. The code was the exact date her mother had passed away. She was actively using the absolute worst day of my entire life to breach my final layer of personal security. She spun the dial to the left, then to the right, her hands moving with steady, unbothered precision. The heavy steel door finally clicked open with a soft, distinct metallic thud that echoed through the computer speakers. Natalie reached her hand deep into the dark cavity of the safe and pulled out the thick manila folder containing my most sensitive personal and corporate identity documents. She quickly opened the top flap, deliberately shuffling through the crisp papers to verify she had precisely what the syndicate demanded. I watched her pull out the notarized tax returns and the embossed birth certificate. A wide, triumphant smile spread slowly across her face in the pale beam of the flashlight. She did not show a single ounce of remorse or hesitation. She casually tossed the irreplaceable documents into a designer leather tote bag, kicked the heavy safe door shut with her bare foot, and hastily rolled the Persian rug back into its proper place. She slipped quietly out of the study and softly closed the oak door, leaving the room entirely empty once again. The video feed returned to absolute stillness, but the emotional damage was permanent and irreversible. The profound, paralyzing shock completely evaporated from my mind, leaving behind a vast, frozen wasteland of absolute clarity. Any lingering fatherly love I had desperately tried to hold onto died in that exact moment. The young girl I had carried on my shoulders, the daughter I had sacrificed my entire physical health to provide for, was entirely gone. She had actively stolen my identity to feed a violent criminal syndicate fully prepared to watch me lose my company and go to federal prison so she could continue living a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle with a degenerate gambler. Evelyn reached over and gently closed the laptop screen, severing the video connection. She looked at me with a profound, quiet understanding, recognizing that the man sitting in front of her had just crossed an emotional point of no return. Benjamin stood tall, his arms tightly crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes analyzing my rigid posture. He knew we possessed the absolute undeniable proof required to launch a catastrophic legal offensive, but he needed the formal executive authorization to unleash the full extent of his forensic power. I slowly stood up from the glass table, feeling a strange, powerful sense of calm wash over my entire body. I smoothed the wrinkles from my dark suit jacket and turned to face my war counsel. I looked directly into Benjamin's eyes, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. I told him to lock down every single corporate asset immediately. I told Evelyn to freeze all the wedding accounts, cancel every supplementary credit card, and instantly initiate a massive untraceable transfer of my core liquid capital into heavily fortified offshore holding trusts where the shadow syndicate could never reach it. I gave them the final absolute green light. Destroy them. The wedding was scheduled to begin in less than 24 hours. They thought they were walking into a lavish celebration of their brilliant success. Instead, they were walking blindly into a massacre. The heavy silence in the hotel suite felt fundamentally different now. It was no longer the silence of shock or disbelief. It was the absolute focused quiet of a demolition crew preparing to detonate a massive structural foundation. Benjamin and Evelyn immediately recognized the profound shift in my demeanor. The grieving father was gone, entirely replaced by the ruthless executive who had spent decades outmaneuvering the most aggressive commercial developers in Chicago. Evelyn did not offer any hollow words of comfort regarding my daughter. She simply nodded, her expression hardening into absolute professional resolve, and turned her attention back to the glowing monitors. She began typing with a renewed furious intensity, pulling together the final pieces of the forensic audit. For the next several hours, the war room operated with flawless, cold efficiency. I paced the length of the suite, watching the city below me transition from the dead of night into the pre-dawn gray. At exactly 6 a.m, Evelyn pushed her chair back from the glass table and let out a long, heavy breath. She had successfully traced the absolute bottom of Preston's digital labyrinth. She projected the final banking schedule onto the large wall monitor for Benjamin and me to review. She explained that Preston had established a newly formed shell corporation in the Cayman Islands exactly 3 days ago. The massive shadow syndicate loan, all $3 million of dirty money, was completely approved and scheduled for final disbursement. Evelyn pointed to the specific digital timestamp on the screen. The wire transfer was officially programmed to drop directly into Preston's offshore account at precisely 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. That was exactly 24 hours before he was supposed to stand at the altar and marry my daughter. Benjamin stepped forward, his eyes scanning the incredibly detailed financial routing numbers and the forged collateral authorizations. He pulled his mobile phone from his jacket pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. He looked at me with strict professional urgency. He stated that we had successfully gathered an overwhelming mountain of undeniable physical and digital evidence. He strongly advised that we immediately contact the federal authorities and the local police department. He wanted to dispatch law enforcement to my home to intercept Natalie before she could hand the stolen documents over to Preston. He wanted to completely freeze the bank transfer right now to prevent the shadow syndicate from establishing any legitimate legal claim against my commercial plumbing company. It was the standard, perfectly rational legal strategy designed to minimize all collateral damage and end the immediate threat. I walked over to the glass table and placed my hand firmly over Benjamin's phone, slowly pushing it down toward the wood. I looked directly into his eyes, my voice barely rising above a low, steady whisper. I told him we were absolutely not calling the police. I told him we were not stopping the document transfer, and we were certainly not halting the bank wire. Benjamin stared at me, his brow deeply furrowed in genuine confusion. He warned me that if that money successfully crossed international borders, the syndicate would possess a fully executed, highly aggressive commercial lien against my entire life's work. He said I was standing on an active landmine and willfully refusing to step off. I shook my head slowly, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep into my chest. I explained my logic with absolute chilling clarity. I told Benjamin that if we intervened right now, if we stopped the transaction before the money actually moved, Preston and Natalie would only be facing preliminary charges of attempted fraud. A clever defense attorney would argue that it was a simple misunderstanding, a foolish mistake made by panicked kids under immense wedding pressure. They might receive a slap on the wrist, a suspended sentence, or a minor financial penalty. That was entirely unacceptable to me. I did not want them to be mildly inconvenienced. I wanted them utterly and permanently destroyed. I wanted them to completely finalize the transaction. I wanted Preston to take physical possession of those stolen documents. I wanted him to submit them to the Shadow Syndicate. I wanted that $3 million of illicit money to successfully wire across international borders into his personal offshore account. Because the exact second that money lands, it ceases to be a theoretical conspiracy. It instantly becomes a completed massive federal wire fraud operation. It becomes a severe international crime that carries decades in federal prison without any possibility of parole. I wanted the steel trap to snap completely shut on their limbs, making it absolutely impossible for them to ever escape the consequences of their betrayal. Benjamin slowly lowered his phone, his eyes widening as he fully grasped the terrifying magnitude of my strategy. A slow, predatory smile began to form on his lips. He completely understood the assignment. However, he immediately raised the critical logistical issue. He asked how we could possibly allow the massive loan to process without actually sacrificing my commercial fleet and my corporate warehouses to the violent Shadow Syndicate. If the lien went live tomorrow afternoon, the criminals would legally own my entire company the moment Preston inevitably defaulted on his gambling debts. I turned to Evelyn, who was already smiling brightly behind her laptop screen. She knew exactly what I was going to suggest. I looked back at Benjamin and told him we were going to render the collateral entirely legally radioactive without alerting Preston or the syndicate. I instructed Benjamin to utilize his extensive contacts within the state judicial system. I ordered him to immediately file a quiet, highly classified ex parte injunction against my own corporate equity. We were going to legally freeze every single asset, every truck, and every warehouse under the strict jurisdiction of a state court holding order, citing an ongoing internal corporate audit. Benjamin began typing furiously on his legal tablet, his mind racing through the complex statutes. He explained that by placing the quiet freeze on the company equity right now, the assets would become completely untouchable by any external commercial entity. The Shadow Syndicate would process the $3 million loan tomorrow afternoon, falsely believing they held a pristine, rock-solid lien against my business. But when they eventually tried to collect their collateral, they would crash directly into a massive, impenetrable wall of state-mandated legal protection. The collateral they thought they held would be absolutely, completely worthless. The loan would be entirely unsecured. It was the ultimate financial ambush. Preston and Natalie would commit federal wire fraud to secure the money, locking themselves into decades of mandatory prison time. Simultaneously, the violent Shadow Syndicate would hand over $3 million without actually securing any valid collateral, making them incredibly violently angry at the man who had just scammed them. Preston was going to be trapped squarely between the full crushing weight of the federal government and the brutal retaliation of a robbed criminal enterprise. As the morning sun finally broke over the Chicago skyline, washing the hotel suite in a bright cold light, the final pieces of the trap clicked perfectly into place. Benjamin gathered his legal drafts, preparing to march into the judge's chambers to secure the silent injunction. Evelyn finalized the digital monitoring protocols, ensuring we would receive an instant notification the very second the wire transfer hit the offshore account tomorrow afternoon. I stood perfectly still, looking at my reflection in the glass window. I felt absolutely no fear, no hesitation, and no regret. They had desperately wanted to play a high-stakes game with an old, clueless plumber. They were about to learn exactly how ruthlessly I could dismantle everything they thought they had won. The heavy atmosphere inside the hotel suite shifted from frantic investigation to a cold and calculated execution. Benjamin immediately stepped out onto the private balcony to coordinate the emergency legal filings with his trusted contacts in the state judicial system, leaving me alone with my devastating thoughts. I stood motionless by the glass table, watching the steady rise of the morning sun over the Chicago skyline, feeling a profound numbness settling deep within my chest. I had just initiated a sequence of events that would ultimately send my only child to federal prison. A father is supposed to protect his daughter from the harsh realities of the world, but Natalie had willingly chosen to align herself with a dangerous predator. She had chosen to sacrifice me without a single second of hesitation or genuine remorse. I was simply returning the exact favor. I walked back toward the makeshift workstation, intending to close the laptop and finally get an hour of sleep before the chaotic wedding preparations began. But Evelyn was not finished. Her sharp eyes remained glued to the glowing monitor. She held up her hand, a silent command for me to wait. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, pulling up a deeply buried subfolder she had just extracted from Natalie's deleted email archives. She stated that she was running a final comprehensive sweep of their shared financial accounts to ensure no secondary offshore trusts had been established. Instead of banking ledgers, her complex tracking algorithm had unexpectedly flagged a series of highly encrypted confirmation receipts hidden in the spam folders. Evelyn leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed in intense concentration, as she bypassed the final layer of digital encryption. She opened a seemingly innocuous email disguised as a promotional newsletter from a luxury travel agency. I stood right behind her chair, looking over her shoulder as the bright digital receipt filled the center of the monitor. It was an official flight itinerary issued by a premium international airline. Evelyn highlighted the passenger names in a stark yellow hue: Preston Rhodes and Natalie Gallagher. I stared at the bold letters, my mind initially struggling to comprehend the logistical necessity of this particular document. They had loudly boasted to our entire extended family about their lavish 3-week honeymoon touring the southern coast of France. I had personally authorized the massive expense account for those specific European reservations, but the flight confirmation displayed on Evelyn's screen had absolutely nothing to do with Paris or the Mediterranean coast. It was a direct, non-stop flight path entirely out of the country. Evelyn scrolled down to reveal the precise ticketing details, and the absolute devastating truth finally struck me with the force of a physical blow. These were 2 first-class one-way tickets to Dubai. The departure time was strictly scheduled for exactly 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. That was merely hours after the lavish wedding reception was supposed to conclude at the Ritz-Carlton. They were not planning a romantic getaway. They were executing a highly orchestrated, permanent escape. Dubai is an incredibly wealthy metropolis with notoriously complex extradition treaties regarding international financial crimes. It is a glittering desert fortress where millions of dollars in stolen cash can easily buy a lifetime of absolute anonymity and untouchable luxury. The entire narrative they had meticulously constructed over the past year was nothing more than a brilliant, blinding smokescreen. There was never going to be a beautiful marriage life in a high-end Chicago condominium. There were never going to be Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, or grandchildren running through my suburban backyard. Every single smile, every loving embrace, and every tear shed over floral arrangements was a purely theatrical performance. The wedding itself was just a massive, expensive distraction, designed exclusively to keep me entirely occupied, while the $3 million shadow loan cleared the international banking wires. They needed a spectacular, highly public event to maintain the illusion of absolute normalcy. They needed me shaking hands, taking photographs, and paying vendors while the criminal syndicate quietly finalized the catastrophic corporate lien against my commercial plumbing empire. Preston had timed the illicit wire transfer to drop into his offshore account on Friday afternoon. By Saturday night, they would be celebrating their fake union, surrounded by our oblivious friends and family. By dawn on Sunday morning, they would be sitting in a private first-class cabin, thousands of miles away, drinking expensive champagne as they permanently severed all ties to their former lives. The sheer breathtaking malice of their escape plan left me completely immobilized. They were not just stealing my money. They were purposefully leaving me behind to face an absolute nightmare of violence and legal ruin. I closed my eyes and let the horrific reality wash over me. When Monday morning arrived, the Shadow Syndicate would instantly realize that Preston had completely vanished with their $3 million. Those ruthless, violent men would not bother chasing a ghost across the globe to the Middle East. They would immediately look at the forged collateral documents Preston had happily provided. They would look directly at Gallagher Mechanical and Logistics Group. They would send their brutal debt collectors straight to my commercial warehouses and my family home. They would come for my fleet of 50 service trucks, completely convinced they held a legitimate legal claim to my entire life's work. And when the federal authorities inevitably descended upon the smoldering wreckage of my business to investigate the massive money laundering operation, they would find my forged signature on every single document. I would be left standing completely alone in the ashes, forced to defend myself against vicious criminal enforcers and aggressive federal prosecutors, while my daughter lived like royalty on the opposite side of the world. She knew the syndicate was dangerous. She knew they threatened extreme physical violence, and she had actively chosen to redirect that violence directly onto my shoulders just to fund her escape. Evelyn remained entirely silent, watching the horrific realization harden every single muscle in my jaw. She slowly closed the email archive, her professional detachment momentarily breaking to reveal a flash of genuine, profound pity. I did not want her deep pity. I did not want anyone's sympathy. The last remaining ounce of paternal grief, the tiny, foolish part of my soul that still wanted to believe my little girl could be saved, was permanently extinguished. The emotional void inside me was instantly filled with a dark, freezing, unbreakable resolve. They had meticulously plotted to destroy me and leave me for dead. They had built a beautiful, incredibly expensive stage to execute their final betrayal. I was simply going to step onto that exact same stage and burn the entire theater to the ground. I thanked Evelyn for her brilliant forensic work and told her to pack up her equipment. The sun was fully up now, casting a bright, harsh light across the city. It was the morning of my daughter's wedding. It was finally time to put on my tailored tuxedo pin, a beautiful white flower to my lapel, and proudly walk her straight down the long, carpeted aisle toward her absolute ruin. I stood still by the window, adjusting the cuffs of my shirt as the morning light washed over the Chicago skyline. The sheer magnitude of their plan to flee to Dubai had momentarily silenced the room, leaving the soft hum of the ventilation system. I was prepared to close the laptop and begin the charade of the wedding. I reached out to shut the glowing screen, ready to face the daughter who had sold me to a shadow syndicate. But Benjamin did not pack away his legal files. Instead, he remained seated at the far end of the glass dining table, staring intensely at a separate encrypted tablet. His face, usually a mask of professional composure, was drained of color. He slowly raised his hand, gesturing for me to stop. He told me in a voice lacking its usual sharp authority that the offshore flight tickets were not the final piece of the puzzle. He ran a deep background sweep on Natalie and Preston, through obscure legal databases, checking for outstanding liabilities they might have tried to bury before fleeing the country. He found no financial liability. It was a meticulously orchestrated legal weapon aimed directly at my personal freedom. Benjamin turned the tablet toward me, his fingers tapping against a classified legal document. He explained that he had tapped into a sealed docket in a neighboring obscure county court, specifically chosen because it was far outside my sphere of legal influence. Natalie had not just been planning her lavish wedding and her subsequent escape to the Middle East. She had been quietly working with a notoriously corrupt private psychiatrist. This unethical doctor was known in underground circles for providing questionable medical evaluations for a steep price. Benjamin pulled up a digital copy of a sworn medical affidavit signed and fully notarized just 3 days ago. The document explicitly and aggressively claimed that I was suffering from severe rapid-onset advanced dementia. The fabricated medical history detailed a completely fictional narrative of my mental decline, describing erratic behavior, severe memory loss, and a total inability to manage my personal and financial affairs. The affidavit painted a tragic, desperate picture of an aging corporate executive who had completely lost his grip on reality. I stared at the black and white text, scanning the clinical terminology and the fraudulent medical conclusions. The audacity of the document was suffocating. Natalie provided false witness testimonies to this corrupt doctor, citing my long hours at the office and my recent grief as fabricated evidence of a severe psychological break. But the medical affidavit was only the foundation of a much darker, far more sinister trap. Benjamin swiped to the next page, revealing an emergency medical injunction. Natalie had petitioned the neighboring county court for temporary emergency guardianship over my medical and financial decisions. The injunction was fully approved and quietly sitting in the judge's queue, waiting to be activated. The timing of the execution was the most terrifying aspect of their strategy. Benjamin explained their plan with cold, clinical precision. They were going to use the massive emotional intensity and overwhelming social stress of the extravagant wedding weekend as the perfect, highly public triggering event. They needed everyone, our friends, our extended family, and my corporate colleagues, to see me under pressure. The true horror of their strategy finally crystallized in my mind. Once the wedding reception concluded and the shadow loan successfully cleared the international wire transfer, Natalie and Preston would head to the airport for their 6 o'clock flight to Dubai. But they were not just leaving me to discover the massive debt. The very moment their plane entered international airspace, Natalie's corrupt legal team would officially activate the emergency medical injunction. Benjamin looked directly into my eyes and told me exactly what would happen next. A specialized medical transport team armed with a court order and accompanied by local law enforcement would arrive at my home early Sunday morning. Because the court order was legally binding and backed by a sworn psychiatric affidavit, I would have no right to refuse. I would be physically restrained, forcibly removed from my house, and transported directly to a locked high-security psychiatric ward. I would be stripped of my smartphone, my corporate laptop, and all of my communication devices. I would be legally classified as a severe danger to myself and completely incapacitated under the eyes of the law. My blood ran completely cold as the absolute perfection of their trap settled into my bones. They knew that when the violent shadow lending syndicate realized Preston had fled with their $3 million, they would immediately execute the fraudulent commercial lien against my plumbing company. They would come after my commercial fleet and my corporate warehouses. If I were sitting at my desk, I could fight them. I could hire Benjamin, freeze the assets, and launch a massive legal defense. But if I were securely locked inside a sterile psychiatric facility, heavily medicated and legally stripped of my corporate authority, I would be defenseless. I would not be able to call my attorneys. I would not be able to contact the federal authorities. The syndicate would simply walk in and liquidate my entire life's work without facing a single ounce of resistance. And when the federal investigators finally unraveled the wire fraud, they would not find a victimized father. They would find a broken, committed dementia patient who appeared to have completely ruined his own company before losing his mind. Natalie was not just stealing my money. She was actively attempting to erase my humanity, my freedom, and my sanity, ensuring I would rot in a locked ward while she lived like royalty in the desert. Evelyn sat motionless, her hands resting quietly on her lap. The noise of the awakening city outside the hotel window felt entirely disconnected from the suffocating gravity of the room. The betrayal was absolute, transcending mere financial greed and entering a realm of pure, unadulterated malice. Any lingering trace of fatherly love, any microscopic fragment of hope that my daughter could eventually be redeemed, died permanently in that exact second. My heart transformed into a block of solid ice. I did not feel sorrow, and I did not feel panic. I felt an overwhelming, terrifying sense of total clarity. The young girl I had raised, the child I had protected with my life, was dead to me. In her place stood a ruthless predator who needed to be completely and systematically dismantled. I turned my gaze away from the medical injunction and looked at Benjamin and Evelyn. I stood tall, my posture rigid, my voice dropping to a low, dangerously calm register. I instructed Benjamin to immediately contact his federal counterparts and prepare the wire fraud documentation for immediate submission the very second the money moved. I told Evelyn to lock down the domestic accounts and ensure the quiet corporate freeze was perfectly invisible to Preston. I gave them the absolute, undeniable green light. We were no longer just defending the company. We were executing a flawless, catastrophic counterstrike. The wedding was going to proceed exactly as they had planned, but the ending would belong entirely to me. I parked my dusty truck in the circular driveway, leaving my heavy overnight bags in the bed to perfectly maintain the illusion of a grueling 2-day fishing trip. I rolled my shoulders forward, deliberately hunching my posture to project the pathetic image of a defeated, exhausted old man who had completely surrendered to his age and grief. I slowly walked through the heavy front doors and immediately felt the chaotic, suffocating energy of the impending wedding. Delivery personnel rushed past me carrying massive boxes of imported silk ribbons, while an event coordinator shouted frantic instructions into a headset. I shuffled quietly toward the main living room, dragging my feet slightly against the polished hardwood floors. Neither of them even looked up when I entered. They were entirely consumed by their own meticulously crafted realities. I stood in the doorway quietly observing the two people who had plotted to steal my company, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and successfully flee to Dubai. I offered a weak, tired sigh, playing the role of the oblivious father to absolute perfection. I mumbled a quiet greeting, acting as though the intense physical toll of my lengthy fishing trip had completely drained the last remaining ounces of my fading mental capacity. Preston was standing near the grand fireplace, and the sheer physical manifestation of his anxiety was almost pathetic to witness. He was sweating profusely, beads of moisture glistening across his forehead, despite the powerful air conditioning cooling the large room. He paced back and forth in tight, erratic circles, his eyes frantically darting down to the glowing screen of his smartphone every few seconds. He was desperately waiting for the digital notification that the $3 million shadow loan had successfully cleared the international wire transfer and landed safely in his newly created offshore account. Every time his phone chimed with a minor notification, his entire body flinched with a violent nervous energy. He ran his trembling fingers through his hair, his tailored designer shirt clinging uncomfortably to his damp back. He looked absolutely nothing like the suave, confident venture capitalist who had boldly sat in my study just a few days ago. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a cornered, degenerate gambler who knew that if that specific wire transfer failed to process, the ruthless criminal syndicate would violently end his life before the wedding cake was even cut. I offered him a slow, confused smile, asking if everything was proceeding smoothly with his tech investments. He let out a breathless, high-pitched laugh, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He assured me everything was perfect, his voice cracking slightly under the crushing, invisible weight of his own massive deception. Natalie was standing at the massive kitchen island, completely ignoring both my arrival and her fiance's visible panic attack. She was hyper-focused on a sprawling array of expensive floral arrangements, violently discarding white roses that did not perfectly match the specific shade of her imported table linens. I stood there, watching my only daughter meticulously arrange the aesthetic details of a wedding she never actually intended to consummate. There was a chilling, absolute detachment in her movements. She did not ask how my trip was. She did not ask if I was tired or hungry. She completely looked straight through me, treating me as nothing more than a convenient piece of background furniture that had already served its primary financial purpose. I watched her perfectly manicured hands aggressively snap the stems of the rejected flowers, realizing that she viewed me exactly the same way. I was just another broken stem to be discarded, so her perfect, fraudulent vision could be realized. The profound coldness of her behavior completely solidified my resolve. I had spent my entire life building an empire to secure her future, and she had repaid that devotion by actively conspiring with a corrupt doctor to erase my freedom and lock me in a sterile psychiatric cell. I gave a pathetic, shaky nod, apologizing for interrupting her very important work, and slowly shuffled out of the kitchen toward the privacy of my locked home office. Once I was safely inside my study, I locked the heavy oak door and completely abandoned the frail old man persona. I stood tall, my mind operating with the sharp, ruthless precision of a corporate executioner. I pulled a secure, untraceable prepaid mobile phone from my jacket pocket and immediately dialed the direct line for the executive events coordinator at the Ritz-Carlton. I calmly identified myself as the primary financial sponsor of the Gallagher wedding. I informed the coordinator that due to a sudden catastrophic corporate emergency, I was officially and permanently canceling all credit card authorizations associated with the event. I explicitly instructed her to halt all pending payments to the luxury catering vendors, the imported floral companies, and the live entertainment bands. I recorded the transaction details meticulously, saving the audio logs into an encrypted digital file named zipper1_20.docs to ensure a perfect legal record of my financial withdrawal. The coordinator gasped, her voice trembling as she frantically explained that stopping the payments now would instantly bankrupt the entire wedding infrastructure. I told her I completely understood the severity of the situation, yet I firmly refused to release any further capital from my primary holding accounts. I then opened a secondary secure application to freeze the remaining vendor escrow accounts, logging those specific transaction blocks into a separate encrypted archive named zipper2_20.docs. I was systematically draining the lifeblood from their lavish celebration with cold precision. The events coordinator panicked, stating she had absolutely no choice but to immediately cancel the venue reservation and lock the ballroom doors. I firmly told her to pause. I did not want the wedding canceled before it even began. I needed the stage set for my final performance. I needed Preston and Natalie to stand proudly in front of our entire social circle, convinced they had successfully pulled off the ultimate heist. I told the coordinator that I had a private courier sitting directly in the hotel lobby with a secure briefcase containing $50,000 in untraceable, crisp, physical cash. I instructed her to take the physical cash as a direct, non-refundable personal payoff to the venue management. In exchange for the briefcase, the hotel would allow the wedding ceremony and the initial reception to proceed exactly as planned, but only until 8 o'clock in the evening. I demanded that precisely at 8 o'clock, the venue staff was to abruptly pull the plug on the entire event. They were to completely shut down the open bars, cut the power to the massive lighting rigs, and boldly present Preston with the massive unpaid invoice directly in front of every single guest. I listened to the coordinator quickly agree to the lucrative cash terms, her tone shifting from panic to greedy compliance. I ended the call and slipped the prepaid phone back into my pocket, taking a slow breath of pure anticipation. I looked at the heavy steel floor safe Natalie had so casually breached. The ultimate trap was now perfectly primed, fully loaded, and waiting to snap shut. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting golden light across Lake Michigan. It was the morning of the wedding, a day supposed to represent the crowning achievement of my life as a father. Instead, it marked the beginning of a meticulously orchestrated execution. I stood before the mirror in my hotel suite, fastening onyx cufflinks onto my white shirt. I slid my arms into my black tuxedo, ensuring my physical appearance was flawless. I pinned a white rose to my lapel, smoothing the dark fabric with steady hands. I did not feel the typical rush of paternal pride that accompanies giving a daughter away. I felt only the deep pounding of a predator waiting in the high grass. I picked up my keys and drove to the Ritz-Carlton, ready to walk into the epicenter of their deception. When I arrived at this grand ballroom, the scale of the event was overwhelming. The venue was decorated with an aggressive, suffocating level of extravagance. Thousands of white orchids tumbled from massive crystal chandeliers, filling the room with sweet perfume. A string quartet played classical melodies, while servers in white jackets glided seamlessly across the marble floor, balancing silver trays loaded with vintage champagne. 300 elite socialites, venture capitalists, and corporate executives filled the room, their expensive jewelry catching the light as they laughed and networked. It was a flawless illusion of wealth and stability, funded entirely by my draining bank accounts and built upon a foundation of absolute fraud. I stood near the floral archway watching the guests mingle when I spotted Preston near the main bar. The suffocating panic that had gripped him in my living room was gone, replaced by a manic arrogance. He held a glass of bourbon, laughing at a joke told by one of his supposed investors. I watched his eyes repeatedly dart down to his smartphone resting on the mahogany bar. He was waiting for the validation of his criminal masterpiece. At exactly 4 o'clock, right on schedule, the phone vibrated violently against the wood. Preston snatched the device with lightning speed. Even from across the crowded room, I could see the overwhelming rush of relief wash over him. The tension completely drained from his shoulders as he stared at the glowing screen. The $3 million shadow loan had successfully cleared. The digital notification confirmed that the massive sum of illicit money had safely deposited into his newly established offshore account. He looked up, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face, convinced he had just pulled off the greatest heist of his life. What Preston did not know and would not discover until it was too late was that Benjamin and my forensic team had been tracking that exact digital pulse. He did not know that federal authorities had already intercepted the routing markers, silently placing a rigid freeze on the offshore account the second the funds landed. He did not know that the collateral lien he had provided to the Shadow Syndicate was radioactive, neutralized by the state court injunction I had filed hours ago. He thought he possessed $3 million in untraceable cash. In reality, he possessed a frozen asset and a perfectly documented federal wire fraud conviction. I watched him order another round of drinks, completely oblivious to the invisible federal crosshairs resting on his chest. The string quartet shifted their melody, signaling the beginning of the formal reception seating. The massive double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and Natalie made her entrance. She looked beautiful, draped in a custom designer gown, covered in hand-sewn pearls. A photography team circled her like hungry sharks, capturing every manufactured smile and staged moment of bridal joy. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting compliments and posing for portraits. I stepped forward, moving into her direct line of sight. As the man who financed this spectacle custom dictated, I should be seated at the head table right beside the bride and groom. I waited for her to acknowledge me, to play the role of the loving daughter in front of the audience. Natalie saw me standing there. Her perfect smile vanished, replaced by a cold, irritated grimace. She glanced over her shoulder to ensure the photography team was occupied before stepping aggressively into my personal space. She did not offer a hug. She did not express a word of gratitude. She leaned in close, the sweet scent of her perfume failing to mask the venom in her voice. She pointed her finger toward the absolute back of the cavernous ballroom, aiming toward a dark corner behind a massive marble pillar. She told me to go sit at table 15. She explicitly stated that Table 15 was far away from the professional cameras and important guests. She hissed that I looked exhausted, and she absolutely refused to let my depressing demeanor ruin the aesthetic perfection of her wedding photographs. She was flawlessly fulfilling the vicious promise she made in the bridal fitting room months ago. She was treating me like a shameful embarrassment that needed to be hidden in the shadows. I looked down at the daughter I no longer recognized. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene. I offered a compliant nod, perfectly maintaining the illusion of the defeated old man she firmly believed me to be. I whispered a quiet apology, turned my back on the glittering head table, and walked across the expansive ballroom. I navigated through the maze of tables and laughing guests until I reached Table 15, a small circle hidden completely in the dim lighting near the service kitchen doors. I pulled out a chair and sat down in the shadows, completely isolated from the celebration. A waiter approached me, offering a glass of expensive champagne. I politely declined the alcohol and requested a cup of black coffee. The waiter returned moments later with a steaming ceramic mug. I wrapped my hands around the warm porcelain, the bitter liquid grounding my senses in the chaotic environment. I leaned back in my chair and watched the glittering spectacle unfold across the room. I watched Preston clinking glasses with his groomsmen, completely unaware that his offshore wealth was entirely frozen and useless. I watched Natalie twirling in her pearl-covered gown, playing the role of a high society queen, oblivious that her fraudulent medical injunction was about to be turned directly against her. I sat quietly in the dark, sipping my bitter coffee, watching the rats celebrate on a beautifully decorated, rapidly sinking ship. They thought they had successfully relegated me to the forgotten shadows. They had no idea that I was simply taking the best possible seat in the house to watch their entire universe burn. The heavy gold hands of the large antique clock mounted on the ballroom wall ticked relentlessly forward. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the evening. I had exactly 2 hours remaining until the power was abruptly cut, the music died, and the reality of their destruction was delivered on a silver platter. I took another slow sip of my coffee, perfectly content to wait in the dark. The dinner service commenced with a flurry of white-coated waiters descending upon the grand ballroom. They carried trays laden with seared filet mignon, butter, poached lobster tails, and imported truffle asparagus. The display was a masterful illusion of unlimited wealth, a feast paid for by the very man they had conspired to destroy. I watched from the dim obscurity of Table 15 as the guests devoured the lavish meal, ignorant of the dark financial crimes funding their evening. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the celebrating crowd, illuminating the designer gowns and tailored suits of the venture capital elite. They laughed and raised their crystal goblets, toasting to a fraudulent future built on forged signatures and a deeply malicious betrayal. I remained seated in my quiet corner, my untouched porcelain coffee cup resting on the fine linen tablecloth. I focused my gaze solely on the head table, where Preston and Natalie sat elevated above the crowd like arrogant, conquering royalty. Preston was the absolute center of attention, radiating a toxic, manufactured charm. He leaned over to whisper into Natalie's ear, his hand casually resting on the stem of his champagne flute. The intense, suffocating anxiety that had gripped him just a few hours ago was entirely gone, washed away by the digital confirmation of his $3 million shadow loan. He firmly believed the trap had closed flawlessly. He believed his offshore accounts were full, his flight to Dubai was secure, and my corporate empire was completely exposed to a ruthless criminal syndicate. He believed he had won. As the final dinner plates were quietly cleared away by the venue staff, the ambient music faded into a soft, classical hum. Preston stood up from his velvet chair, picking up a silver spoon. He began tapping it gently against the rim of his crystal glass. The sharp, clear, chiming sound echoed across the massive ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of all 300 guests. The room fell into a polite, anticipatory hush. Preston stepped confidently toward the center of the elevated stage, taking the wireless microphone from the event coordinator. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket, flashing a brilliant, completely synthetic smile at the sea of expectant faces. He began his speech with a smooth, practiced delivery, thanking the guests for traveling from across the country to witness their beautiful union. He spoke passionately about love destiny and the incredible journey he and Natalie were about to embark upon. The crowd offered warm, gentle applause, completely captivated by his charismatic performance. But then he shifted his focus. He turned his gaze away from the audience and looked out across the vast ballroom, searching the tables for me. He dramatically placed his hand over his heart and directed his voice into the microphone with a sickening layer of false humility. He stated that none of this breathtaking elegance would have been possible without the immense generosity of his new father-in-law. He praised my decades of hard work, my dedication to family, and my unwavering support of their future. He raised his glass toward the general direction of the crowd, publicly declaring his deep, eternal gratitude for the man who had supposedly welcomed him into the family with open arms. He was mocking me. It was a calculated, incredibly arrogant display of absolute dominance. He was standing on a stage I had paid for publicly, thanking me for a future he was actively stealing. Firmly convinced I was too clueless and emotionally defeated to understand his true intentions. The guests turned their heads, searching the brightly lit tables near the front of the room, expecting me to stand and accept the public acknowledgement. When they could not find me among the honored family members, a low murmur of confusion began to ripple through the crowd. I did not rush. I slowly pushed my chair back from the shadows of table 15. The legs of the chair scraped softly against the polished marble floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my black tuxedo jacket. I stepped out from behind the massive architectural pillar and began to walk down the long central aisle of the grand ballroom. My deliberate, unhurried pace instantly drew the attention of the room. The murmurs died down, replaced by a dense, heavy silence that felt almost physical. 300 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I marched straight toward the elevated stage. I did not look at the venture capitalists, the socialites, or the confused relatives. I kept my vision locked entirely on Preston. The smug, arrogant smile slowly began to melt from his face. His posture stiffened. The hand holding the crystal champagne flute dropped slightly to his side. He had expected me to cower in the dark corner, too broken and exhausted to participate. He had not expected the cold, unyielding presence of a man marching toward him with absolute predatory focus. I reached the edge of the stage and calmly ascended the 3 carpeted steps. Preston instinctively took a half step backward, his eyes widening with a sudden, unexplainable apprehension. He tried to quickly recover his charming facade, forcing a strained, nervous smile as he held the wireless microphone out toward me. He stammered slightly loudly, announcing to the quiet room that the generous father of the bride wanted to say a few words. I did not smile back. I reached out and took the microphone from his trembling hand. I turned my back to him, completely dismissing his presence, and walked directly to the center of the stage. I looked down at the head table, locking my eyes squarely with my daughter. Natalie sat frozen in her pearl-covered gown. The color had entirely drained from her face, leaving her complexion as white as the orchids cascading from the ceiling. She recognized the look in my eyes. It was not the soft, forgiving gaze of a grieving father. It was the absolute, unforgiving stare of a corporate executioner. I stood in the dead silence of the ballroom, letting the heavy anticipation stretch for a long, agonizing moment. When I finally spoke, I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger or let any emotion crack my delivery. I spoke with a terrifying, absolute calm that echoed through the massive speakers and chilled the entire room. I brought the microphone closer and addressed the crowd, thanking them for gathering to celebrate this monumental occasion. Then I turned my attention back to Natalie. I told her that I had spent the entire morning reflecting on the true meaning of family loyalty and the sacrifices we make. I told her that I had been thinking about the beautiful conversation we shared in the bridal boutique just a few months ago. I watched Natalie's breath hitch in her throat. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. I began to recite her exact words, delivering them with flawless, chilling accuracy, ensuring every single guest heard exactly what my daughter truly thought of me, preserved, like a file named zipper1_22.docx and a file named zipper_22.docx waiting to completely destroy her tonight. I projected my voice clearly into the microphone, ensuring every syllable bounced off the crystal chandeliers and reached the furthest corners of the grand ballroom. I quoted her exact words, detailing how she had stood in that high-end bridal boutique, and coldly declared that I was nothing but a walking automated teller machine. I recounted how she laughed with her bridesmaids, about draining my retirement accounts, how she complained about my worn hands and my tired face, and how she eagerly anticipated the day she could finally ship me off to a cheap nursing home and claim her full inheritance. I did not rush the delivery. I let the absolute cruelty of her own statements hang in the sterile air. A collective horrified gasp rippled through the 300 elite guests. The venture capitalists, the socialites, and our extended family members stared at the head table in pure shock. The beautiful, glowing bride they had been admiring all evening was instantly unmasked as a ruthless, calculating parasite. Natalie tried to stand, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no words came out. The sheer shock of having her darkest, most private malice broadcasted to her entire social circle completely paralyzed her. With Natalie entirely immobilized by her public humiliation, I slowly turned my body and locked my gaze onto the groom. Preston was gripping the edge of the stage, his knuckles white, his chest heaving, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He looked at me with the terrified, wide eyes of a cornered animal, realizing it had stepped into a steel trap. I walked a few paces closer to him, my voice remaining remarkably steady and terrifyingly calm. I looked down at his shaking hands and addressed him directly through the massive speaker system. "You thought I was a clueless old man who fixed air conditioners," I stated, letting the words resonate through the quiet room. "You looked at my calloused hands and my simple suits, and you firmly believed I was nothing more than a foolish, uneducated blue-collar worker waiting to be swindled. But an engineer knows how to read blueprints, Preston, even financial ones." The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He knew exactly what those words meant. He knew the facade was completely shattered. I turned back to face the sea of shocked guests, my gaze sweeping over the tables draped in imported silk and loaded with empty plates of seared filet mignon. I raised the microphone and announced with a tone of casual detachment that I hoped everyone had thoroughly enjoyed the lavish meal and the vintage champagne. I paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the next blow. I informed the 300 guests that the exquisite food they were currently digesting, the thousands of white orchids hanging above their heads, and the very chairs they were sitting on were entirely unpaid for. I explained that I had officially canceled every single credit card authorization and halted every vendor payment earlier this morning. The collective gasp from the audience was louder this time, followed immediately by a frantic wave of whispering. I pointed toward the back of the room, directly at the venue management team, who were currently flanking the exit doors, holding thick stacks of unpaid invoices. I loudly declared that Preston and Natalie were attempting to throw the social event of the season without spending a single dime of their own money, relying entirely on a fraudulent illusion of wealth to impress a room full of people they secretly despised. The whispers in the crowd escalated into a chaotic hum, but I was not finished. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence, and the room instantly obeyed. I turned back to Preston, who was physically trembling, sweat pouring down his face and soaking the collar of his expensive tuxedo. I announced to his fellow venture capitalists and corporate colleagues that the man standing before them was not a successful tech investor, but a degenerate gambler. I revealed the crushing reality of his $2.5 million gambling debt, explaining how he owed that massive sum to a highly dangerous, violent underground syndicate. The wealthy guests stared at Preston in absolute disgust and horror. I did not stop there. I outlined exactly how Preston and Natalie had conspired to forge my signature on commercial loan documents, attempting to secure a $3 million shadow loan against my lifetime of work to pay off his criminal enforcers. And finally, I delivered the killing blow. I told the audience about their meticulously packed bags and the 2 first-class one-way tickets to Dubai scheduled for departure in just a few hours. I explained that they had orchestrated this entire lavish wedding merely as a theatrical distraction, intending to flee the country and leave me completely ruined, facing federal prosecutors and violent debt collectors alone. Natalie could no longer maintain her paralyzed silence. She suddenly shattered the tension, lunging forward from the head table, with her hands curled into fists. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and completely unhinged, calling me a liar and a bitter, insane old man. She shrieked to the audience that I was suffering from dementia, desperately trying to salvage the narrative she had built with the corrupt psychiatrist. But her hysterical screaming only solidified her guilt in the eyes of the crowd. The guests recoiled from her, their faces twisting in genuine revulsion. Preston, however, did not try to defend himself. The survival instinct of a coward finally kicked in. He realized that his offshore accounts were likely frozen, his criminal debt was now public knowledge, and his entire life was effectively over. He dropped his crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass shattered into 100 pieces against the wooden stage. He spun around, frantically searching for an exit. He leaped off the side of the elevated platform, stumbling slightly before breaking into a desperate, panicked sprint toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. He shoved violently past a stunned waiter, knocking a silver tray to the floor in a desperate bid for freedom. He sprinted down the central aisle, his polished dress shoes slipping slightly against the smooth marble floor as he desperately tried to maintain his balance and escape the room. The crowd parted frantically, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored suits out of his path as he barreled toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the venue with the frantic urgency of a doomed man running for his very life. He was panting, his eyes fixed purely on the exit, completely blinded and deeply driven by the absolute terror of the violent syndicate and the looming threat of federal prison. He reached out his trembling hands, preparing to push the heavy brass handles and escape into the dark Chicago night, hoping to find sanctuary somewhere in the sprawling city streets. But before his fingers could even make contact with the metal, the massive double doors slammed open from the outside with a deafening, violent crash, entirely blocking his only path forward. A squad of federal agents and local police officers marched into the grand ballroom with overwhelming, undeniable authority. Preston collided violently with the lead agent, his desperate momentum instantly halted by a solid wall of tactical gear. He was immediately tackled to the polished marble floor, his expensive designer tuxedo tearing at the shoulder as officers forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the stunned room. His elite investors, the very people he had so desperately tried to impress with his fraudulent wealth, watched in absolute horror as federal agents formally read him his rights regarding international wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. He writhed against the cold floor, his pathetic cries for mercy completely ignored by the stoic officers, leaving him completely humiliated and permanently ruined. I slowly turned my attention back to the head table. Natalie was trembling violently, her meticulously crafted high society facade completely shattered. The devastating reality of her situation finally crushed her. The frozen offshore accounts, the canceled luxury vendors, the massive unpayable gambling debt, and the imminent arrival of a violent criminal syndicate had all converged upon her at once. She stumbled blindly off the elevated stage. The heavy fabric of her $18,000 pearl gown caught on the carpet, sending her crashing to her knees right at the edge of the polished dance floor. She scrambled toward me on her hands and knees, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-streaked face. She sobbed uncontrollably, dark mascara running down her pale cheeks. desperately grabbing at the fabric of my trousers. She begged me to save her, to pay off the syndicate, to call my powerful attorneys, loudly pleading that she was my little girl and that she had just made a terrible mistake. I looked down at the pathetic, groveling creature weeping at my feet. The final lingering traces of my paternal instinct were completely eradicated, replaced by a permanent, unbreakable resolve. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her clutching hands to release my clothing. I looked directly into her terrified, desperate eyes. "You said my life was worthless, Natalie." I stated, my voice echoing one last time through the deadly quiet ballroom. "Let's see how much yours is worth without my money." I did not wait for her frantic response. I placed the wireless microphone gently onto the nearest linen-covered table. I turned around and walked straight down the central aisle. The massive crowd of stunned, silent guests parted instantly, creating a wide path to let me pass. I walked out of the Ritz-Carlton without ever looking back, leaving my daughter sobbing on the floor in the smoldering ruins of a disaster she had entirely orchestrated. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, shutting out the hysterical sounds of a ruined wedding. The cool night air of the city felt incredibly refreshing against my face as I stepped out into the quiet darkness. I climbed into my dusty truck and drove through the empty streets, heading directly to the commercial warehouse of Gallagher Mechanical and Logistics Group. The massive building was dark, but my trusted operations manager, Derek, was waiting for me inside my private office, exactly as I had requested. He had stood faithfully by my side for 20 grueling years, working tirelessly to help build the corporate empire while my own flesh and blood plotted to steal it. Derek watched me with quiet respect, fully aware of the monumental shift taking place. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, pulled out a thick stack of finalized legal documents prepared earlier by Benjamin, and picked up my fountain pen. With a remarkably steady hand and a completely clear conscience, I signed the corporate transfer paperwork, officially handing the entire business over to a loyal, hardworking man who actually deserved my legacy. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love should never mean blinding yourself to the truth. We spend our lives building a legacy to protect our children, but sometimes the greatest danger to that legacy is the very children we raised. True family is defined by respect, integrity, and mutual care, not by a shared last name. And when someone finally shows you who they truly are, when they look at your lifelong sacrifices and only see an ATM, believe them the first time. Protect your dignity, guard your peace, and never let anyone make you a victim in your home. If this story opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below, and I read every single one. See you next time.